The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle, but inside the royal residence, darkness seemed to have settled over everything. King Charles III sat in his private study, staring at the unopened letter that had arrived 3 days ago. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it again, the official hospital seal catching the light from the tall windows. Dr. Margaret Harrison had been more than just the royal family's physician for the past 20 years. She had delivered difficult news before, had seen them through various health scares, but this letter carried something different. Charles could feel it in the weight of the envelope, in the careful way it had been sealed. The door to his study opened quietly, and Camilla entered carrying a tea tray. Her movements were deliberate and calm, the way they always were when she sensed tension in the air. She had perfected this ability over their years together, reading his moods like a familiar book. "You haven't touched your breakfast," she said softly, setting the tray on the small table near his chair. "The staff is worried." Charles looked up at his wife, taking in her concerned expression. Even in her casual morning attire, she carried herself with the grace expected of a queen. Her graying hair was pulled back simply and without makeup. The lines of worry around her eyes were more visible. "I'm not particularly hungry this morning," he replied, his voice carrying more weight than usual. Camilla moved closer, her eyes falling on the unopened letter in his hands. She had noticed it yesterday too, and the day before. Whatever was inside had been troubling him deeply, and his reluctance to share it with her was unlike their usual dynamic. "Charles," she said, settling into the chair across from him, "what is that letter about?" For a moment he considered deflecting, perhaps making up some excuse about parliamentary business or estate matters. But looking at Camilla's face, he realized that she already knew this was something significant. Their partnership had been built on honesty, even when the truth was uncomfortable. "It's from Dr. Harrison," he said finally. "About Margaret." The name hung in the air between them. Margaret Thornberry had been Charles's closest friend since their university days at Cambridge. While the public knew little about their friendship, those within the inner circle understood the depth of their connection. Margaret had been there through his divorce from Diana, through the difficult years that followed, and had remained a steady presence even after his marriage to Camilla. Camilla's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Margaret had always been a sensitive subject, not because of any romantic involvement, but because she represented a part of Charles's life that existed before Camilla, a connection that ran deeper than most people understood. "What about Margaret?" Camilla asked, her voice carefully neutral. Charles finally tore open the envelope, his movements sharp and decisive. As he read the contents, Camilla watched his face change. The color drained from his cheeks and his breathing became shallow. When he finished reading, he let the letter fall to his lap and stared out the window. "She's dying," he said simply. "Advanced stage cancer. Dr. Harrison says she has perhaps weeks, maybe less." The words settled heavily in the room. Camilla felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over her. Sympathy for Margaret, whom she had known peripherally for years. Concern for Charles, who was clearly devastated. And something else, something she didn't want to acknowledge even to herself. "I'm so sorry," she said, and meant it. "I know how much she means to you." Charles nodded, his eyes still fixed on the distant gardens. "She's been asking for me. Dr. Harrison says she's been quite insistent about it, actually. She wants to say goodbye." The phrase "say goodbye" echoed in Camilla's mind. She understood the gravity of what Charles was telling her, but she also understood something else. This wasn't just about a final visit between old friends. This was about Charles confronting a piece of his past that had always remained separate from their life together. "Of course you must go to her," Camilla said, though something inside her resisted the words. Charles turned to look at her then, searching her face for something she couldn't quite identify. "She's at a private facility in Scotland. It would mean being away for several days, possibly longer." The practical considerations began to surface in Camilla's mind. Charles's schedule was packed with official engagements. There were state dinners planned, meetings with foreign dignitaries, and the annual charity galas that required both their presence. Beyond that, there were the ever-present concerns about public perception and media attention. "The press will notice if you disappear for days," she said carefully. "There will be questions." "Let them question," Charles replied, his voice gaining strength. "Some things are more important than maintaining appearances." Camilla recognized the tone. It was the same voice he used when discussing matters of personal principle, the voice that had insisted on marrying her despite public opposition years earlier. She knew that once Charles set his mind on something he considered morally necessary, very little could dissuade him. "What exactly is Dr. Harrison recommending?" she asked, trying to approach the situation practically. Charles picked up the letter again, scanning the carefully worded medical language. "She suggests that if I want to see Margaret lucid and able to communicate, it should be soon. Perhaps within the next week, a week," Camilla calculated quickly in her mind. They had the opening of Parliament in 4 days, followed by a state visit from the Australian Prime Minister. The following week included the annual Children's Charity Gala, an event that meant a great deal to both of them. "The timing is complicated," she said softly. Charles looked at her sharply. "Timing? Camilla, this woman has been one of my dearest friends for over 40 years. She's dying, and she's asking to see me. How is timing even a consideration?" The edge in his voice surprised her. Charles was typically measured in his responses, even during disagreements. But something about this situation had touched a nerve, activated a protectiveness she rarely saw from him. "I didn't mean it that way," she said quickly. "I'm simply thinking about the practical challenges of rearranging everything." But even as she spoke, Camilla knew that wasn't entirely true. The practical challenges were real, but they weren't insurmountable. What troubled her more was the thought of Charles spending his possibly final days with Margaret, revisiting memories and connections that had nothing to do with their life together. The morning sun had climbed higher, filling the study with bright light that somehow made the conversation feel even more intense. Charles stood and walked to the window, his silhouette framed against the glass. "I need to go to her, Camilla," he said quietly. "I need to say goodbye." The afternoon brought no relief from the tension that had settled over the royal household. Charles had retreated to the gardens after their conversation, walking the familiar paths he had known since childhood. Camilla watched him from the morning room window, noting the way his shoulders carried the weight of grief even as he maintained his characteristic upright posture. She had spent the hours since their talk making phone calls and reviewing schedules. On the surface, she was doing exactly what any supportive wife would do, working to clear the way for her husband to fulfill what he saw as an obligation to an old friend. But beneath her efficient exterior, a storm of conflicting emotions churned. Lady Sarah Morrison, Charles's private secretary, had been surprisingly accommodating when Camilla explained the situation. The upcoming engagements could be rescheduled, she assured Camilla, though it would require some delicate maneuvering with various diplomatic offices. The Prime Minister's visit could be postponed by a few days, and the charity gala could proceed with Camilla hosting alone if necessary. His Majesty's presence isn't absolutely essential for any of the scheduled events this week, Lady Sarah had said diplomatically. Though his absence will certainly be noted, that phrase lingered in Camilla's mind. His absence will certainly be noted. In the years since becoming Queen Consort, she had learned to think constantly about public perception, about the careful balance between personal desires and royal duty. Every decision was scrutinized, every action interpreted through the lens of tradition and expectation. When Charles returned from his walk, he found Camilla in the small sitting room adjacent to their private quarters. She had changed into a more formal afternoon dress, and her expression was composed in the way it became when she was preparing to discuss serious matters. "I've spoken with Lady Sarah," she began without preamble. "The schedule can be adjusted to allow you to travel to Scotland." Charles paused in the doorway, studying her face. "Thank you," he said carefully. "That must have required considerable effort." "It did," she admitted. "But it can be done. However, there are some considerations we need to discuss." Charles took a seat across from her, and Camilla was struck by how formal this felt, how different from their usual easy communication. But this wasn't a usual situation, and the undercurrents of their conversation made everything feel more weighty. "The media will ask questions," she continued. "Your disappearance from public events, especially for several days, will generate speculation. We need to decide how much information we're willing to share." "We could simply say I'm attending to personal matters," Charles suggested. "We could," Camilla agreed. "But if it becomes known that you're visiting a dying woman, particularly one with whom you have a long personal history, the speculation will become much more intense." She wasn't wrong, and Charles knew it. The British press had an insatiable appetite for stories that touched on the royal family's personal relationships. Margaret's name had appeared in occasional gossip columns over the years, usually in the context of the king's mysterious longtime friend. Any attention focused on their relationship now would be magnified by the dramatic circumstances. "Are you suggesting I shouldn't go?" Charles asked, his voice carrying a warning edge. "I'm not suggesting anything," Camilla replied carefully. "I'm simply outlining the potential consequences so we can make an informed decision." But Charles heard something else in her tone, something that made him lean forward in his chair. "Camilla, what aren't you saying?" For a moment she hesitated. They had built their marriage on honesty, on the foundation of having both learned from previous relationships how destructive secrets could be. But this honesty had always been tempered by wisdom, by knowing when and how to share difficult truths. "I'm concerned about what this means," she said finally. "Not just the practical implications, but what it represents." "What it represents," Charles repeated. Camilla took a breath before continuing. "Margaret has been a constant in your life for 40 years. She was there through your marriage to Diana, through the divorce, through all the difficult years afterward. She represents a continuity that exists independent of our relationship." Charles was quiet for a long moment, processing what she was saying. "Are you jealous, Camilla?" The directness of the question surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Charles had always been capable of cutting through diplomatic language to reach the heart of a matter. "I don't know if jealous is the right word," she said slowly, "but I am troubled by the intensity of your reaction to this news. You've been unable to eat, unable to focus on anything else. You're prepared to disrupt important state business to rush to her bedside." "She's dying," Charles said simply. "I understand that. But people die, Charles. People you care about, people you've known for years. This feels different, and I need to understand why." The conversation had reached a point of dangerous honesty, the kind that could either strengthen their relationship or damage it permanently. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the same gardens where he had sought solace earlier. "Margaret knew me before I was king," he said finally, "before I was even heir apparent in any meaningful way. She knew the person I was before duty and expectation shaped everything about my life." Camilla listened, recognizing the significance of what he was sharing. "When Diana and I were struggling, when the press was tearing apart everything I tried to do, Margaret was the one person I could talk to who remembered why I had wanted to do this job in the first place. She reminded me of my ideals, my original vision for what kind of king I wanted to be." "And you feel you owe her something for that," Camilla said. "I feel I owe her everything for that," Charles corrected. "She helped me remember who I was when I was losing myself completely." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Camilla understood now why this felt different, why Charles's reaction had been so intense. Margaret wasn't just an old friend facing death. She was a keeper of his authentic self, a link to the person he had been before the crown had demanded so many compromises. "I see," Camilla said quietly. "Do you?" Charles turned from the window to face her. "Because I need you to understand that this isn't about choosing between past and present. It's about honoring someone who helped preserve the parts of me that I was able to bring into our marriage." It was a beautiful sentiment, and Camilla recognized the truth in it. But it also highlighted something that had always been present in their relationship, the sense that she had inherited a man who had been shaped by profound experiences. That didn't include her. "I do understand," she said, "and I support your need to see her." Charles studied her face, looking for signs of the reservation he had heard in her voice earlier. "But," Camilla hesitated again. The easy answer was to let the conversation end here, to accept his explanation and move forward with the practical arrangements for his trip. But something compelled her to push deeper, to voice the concern that had been growing since their morning conversation. "I'm worried about what saying goodbye to Margaret will mean for you," she said. "I'm worried about what it will mean for us." The admission surprised them both. Charles returned to his chair, leaning forward to better study his wife's expression. "What do you mean?" "Margaret represents a part of your life that was unmarked by compromise, by the weight of kingship, by all the practical considerations that govern our daily existence. Saying goodbye to her means saying goodbye to that connection to your younger self." Charles was quiet, considering her words. "I'm concerned," Camilla continued, that after she's gone you'll feel more trapped by duty, more disconnected from the ideals that originally motivated you. And I'm worried that you'll blame me, at least partially, for not being able to provide what she provided. The honesty of her admission created a new intimacy between them, even as it revealed the fragility that existed beneath their strong partnership. Charles reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. The helicopter ride to Scotland felt both endless and too short. Charles stared out at the countryside below, watching familiar landmarks pass beneath the aircraft. The weather had turned gray and misty, matching his somber mood as he prepared himself for what would likely be his final conversation with Margaret. Dr. Harrison had chosen a private facility tucked away in the Scottish Highlands, far from the prying eyes of media and public attention. The building was modern but designed to blend with the natural landscape, surrounded by ancient pine trees and rolling hills that Margaret had always loved. Charles remembered her describing this exact type of setting as her ideal place to find peace. As the helicopter touched down, Charles saw Dr. Harrison waiting near the entrance to the facility. Her expression was professionally composed, but he could read the concern in her eyes. They had worked together long enough for him to recognize when she was delivering particularly difficult news through her demeanor, rather than words. "Your Majesty," she said as he approached, "thank you for coming so quickly. How is she?" Charles asked without preamble. Dr. Harrison paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's been holding on, quite literally. The nursing staff says she's been asking about your arrival every few hours, but she's very weak. I need to prepare you for how much she's changed." Charles nodded, though nothing could really prepare someone for seeing a dear friend in the final stages of illness. "Is she in pain?" "We're managing her comfort as best we can. She's lucid most of the time, though she tires easily. I'd recommend keeping your visit relatively brief, perhaps an hour or two at most." As they walked through the quiet corridors of the facility, Charles noticed the careful attention to creating a peaceful environment. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and artwork that emphasized natural themes all contributed to a sense of serenity that was distinctly different from the clinical atmosphere of most medical facilities. "She's in the corner room," Dr. Harrison explained as they approached a wooden door with Margaret's name on a small plaque. "She specifically requested the room with the best view of the hills." Charles paused with his hand on the door handle. "Dr. Harrison, has she said anything about what she wants to discuss with me?" The doctor's expression softened. "She's mentioned wanting to ensure that certain things are said while she still can. Beyond that, I think she simply wants the comfort of your presence." Taking a deep breath, Charles opened the door and stepped into the room. The space was filled with afternoon light from large windows that looked out over the highland landscape. Medical equipment was present but kept discreet, and the overall feeling was more like a comfortable hotel room than a hospital. Margaret was propped up in an adjustable bed, looking out the window when Charles entered. When she turned toward him, he was struck by how much she had changed. The vibrant, energetic woman he had known for decades had been replaced by someone fragile and pale, though her eyes still held the intelligence and warmth he remembered. "Charles," she said, her voice weaker than he had ever heard it, but still carrying the affection that had characterized their friendship. "You came?" "Of course I came," he replied, moving to the chair beside her bed. "How could I not?" Margaret smiled, and for a moment Charles caught a glimpse of the person he had known for so many years. "I wasn't entirely sure you would be able to get away. I know how complicated your schedule is." "Nothing is more important than this," Charles said simply, and meant it. They looked at each other for a moment, both acknowledging the gravity of the situation without needing to say it directly. Margaret reached out a thin hand and Charles took it gently. "I want you to know," Margaret said, "that getting to be your friend has been one of the great privileges of my life, not because you're the king, but because of who you are as a person." The words hit Charles harder than he had expected. "Margaret, you've given me far more than I've given you." "That's not true," she said with a slight shake of her head. "But I didn't ask you here to debate who owes whom what. I asked you here because there are things I want to say while I still can." Charles squeezed her hand gently. "I'm listening." Margaret shifted slightly in the bed, gathering her strength. "I want to talk about the person you were when we first became friends, and the person you've become. I want you to understand that the changes don't represent a loss of your essential self." Charles felt a tightness in his chest. This was exactly the conversation Camilla had predicted. the one that would force him to confront the evolution of his identity over the decades. When we met at Cambridge, Margaret continued, you had such clear ideas about what kind of leader you wanted to be. You talked about using your position to advocate for environmental causes, to bridge divides between different communities, to modernize the monarchy while preserving its best traditions. I remember, Charles said quietly. And you've done all of those things, Margaret said firmly. Perhaps not in exactly the way you envisioned when you were 20, but you've remained true to those core values. The environmental work, the interfaith dialogue, the support for traditional crafts and sustainable communities, all of that came from the idealistic young man I knew decades ago. Charles felt tears threatening. But at what cost? How many compromises? How many times did I have to set aside personal feelings for the sake of duty? The same number of times that every adult has to choose between competing values, Margaret replied. The difference is that your choices happen in public, under scrutiny with consequences that affect millions of people. She paused, breathing slowly before continuing. I want you to understand something, Charles. The fact that you feel the weight of those compromises, that you still question whether you've made the right choices, that proves that you haven't lost your essential self. A person without ideals doesn't struggle with the gap between vision and reality. Charles absorbed her words, feeling both comforted and challenged by her perspective. There's something else, Margaret said, her voice becoming quieter. I want to talk about Camilla. Charles looked at her with surprise. This wasn't a topic they had discussed extensively over the years, though Margaret had always been supportive of his relationship choices. I know that some people view our friendship as somehow competing with your marriage, Margaret said. I want you to know that I've never seen it that way, and I hope you haven't either. I haven't, Charles assured her. Camilla understands that different relationships serve different purposes, Margaret smiled. She's wiser than I gave her credit for then, but I want to say this clearly. What I've provided to you as a friend is different from what she provides as a wife and partner. Neither is more or less valuable. She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. I've been the keeper of your memories and ideals. She's the partner for your present and future. Don't let losing one make you undervalue the other. The insight was remarkably similar to what Camilla had said the night before, and Charles found himself marveling at how well these two women understood both him and each other. Actually, Charles said, reaching into his jacket pocket, Camilla asked me to give you this. He handed Margaret the envelope that Camilla had given him that morning. Margaret looked at it with curiosity before opening it carefully. As she read the contents, her expression softened. She wrote to me, Margaret asked. She said it was just a few words from one woman to another. Margaret folded the letter carefully. She thanked me for being your friend during the difficult years, and she promised to take care of the person you've become. It's quite beautiful, actually. Charles felt a surge of love for his wife, amazed once again by her capacity for grace and generosity, even in difficult circumstances. You're very lucky to have her, Margaret said, and she's lucky to have you, though I suspect she knows that. They talked for another hour, covering memories from their decades of friendship, discussing mutual friends and shared experiences. Margaret's energy came and went in waves, but her mental clarity remained strong throughout their conversation. As the afternoon light began to fade, Charles sensed that their time was drawing to a close. Margaret had grown noticeably more tired, and he could see the effort it took for her to maintain the conversation. I should let you rest, he said gently. Margaret nodded. I'm glad you came, Charles. This was exactly what I needed. Is there anything else you want to say? He asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening landscape beyond her window. Just this. Don't let my death make you feel like you're losing your connection to who you used to be. The best parts of that young man are still there, woven into the fabric of who you've become. Trust Camilla to help you see that when you doubt it. Charles leaned forward and kissed Margaret's forehead gently. Thank you for everything. For 40 years of friendship, for believing in me, for helping me remember who I wanted to be. Thank you for letting me be part of your journey, Margaret replied. Take care of yourself and take care of that remarkable wife of yours. As Charles prepared to leave, Margaret called his name one more time. Charles, when you get home, tell Camilla that her letter meant more to me than she could possibly know. Tell her that I'm grateful she understands what friendship can mean. and that I trust her completely with your happiness." The flight back to Windsor Castle felt different from the journey to Scotland. Charles sat in contemplative silence, processing everything Margaret had shared with him during their final conversation. The landscape below looked the same, but something inside him had shifted during those hours in the Highland facility. Dr. Harrison had called just as his helicopter was preparing to depart. Margaret had passed away peacefully in her sleep, less than 3 hours after his visit. The news hit him with a mixture of profound sadness and unexpected relief. She had gotten her goodbye, had said the things she needed to say, and had died with the dignity and grace that had characterized her entire life. As the aircraft approached Windsor, Charles could see the familiar lights of the castle coming into view. Somewhere in those rooms, Camilla was waiting for him, probably managing the various responsibilities he had left behind while dealing with her own concerns about how this trip had affected him. The evening air was crisp as Charles disembarked and made his way into the castle. The staff moved with their usual quiet efficiency, but he could sense their awareness of his mood. Word had somehow already reached them about Margaret's death, probably through Dr. Harrison's office, and their respectful sympathy was evident in their subdued greetings. He found Camilla in their private sitting room, reading by the fireplace. She looked up as he entered, and he could see the question in her eyes before she spoke. "How was she?" Camilla asked softly. "At peace," Charles replied, settling into the chair across from her. "She died about an hour ago." Camilla set down her book and moved to sit beside him on the sofa. "I'm so sorry, Charles, but I'm glad you were able to see her." Charles nodded, feeling the full weight of grief beginning to settle over him. "She asked me to give you a message." "A message?" "She said your letter meant more to her than you could possibly know. She was grateful that you understood what friendship could mean, and she said she trusted you completely with my happiness." Camilla was quiet for a moment, absorbing the significance of Margaret's words. "That's very generous of her." "It was typical Margaret," Charles said with a sad smile. Even facing death, she was thinking about other people's well-being. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the fire crackle in the fireplace. Charles found himself thinking about all the conversations he and Margaret had shared over the years, all the moments of support and understanding that had helped shape him into the person he had become. "She talked about you," he said eventually. Camilla looked at him with surprise. "About me?" She wanted to make sure I understood the difference between what she provided as a friend and what you provide as a wife. She said neither was more or less valuable, just different. "That's very wise," Camilla said thoughtfully. "She also said something else," Charles continued. "She told me not to let her death make me feel like I was losing my connection to who I used to be. She said the best parts of that young man are still there, woven into who I've become." Camilla studied his face carefully. "And do you believe that?" Charles considered the question seriously. "I think I'm beginning to. Margaret helped me see that the struggle I feel sometimes, the tension between ideals and reality, doesn't mean I've lost my essential self. It means I still care about the same things I always cared about." "She sounds like she was a remarkable friend," Camilla said. "She was. But Camilla, I want you to know something important. Seeing Margaret today, saying goodbye to her, it didn't make me wish for the past or regret the present. It made me more grateful for what we have together." Camilla looked at him with curiosity. "How so?" "Margaret knew the person I was before I learned how to balance idealism with responsibility. You know, the person I've become after learning that balance. Both relationships have been precious to me, but the relationship with you is the one that helps me navigate the life I actually live." The insight seemed to surprise Camilla, who had spent the past few days worrying about exactly the opposite possibility. "I was concerned," she admitted, "that seeing her would make you feel more trapped by duty, more disconnected from your original vision for your life." "It had the opposite effect," Charles said. "It helped me see that duty and idealism don't have to be opposing forces. Margaret showed me that the environmental work I do, the interfaith dialogue I promote, the support I give to traditional communities, all of that came from the same place as my youthful idealism. It just took different forms than I originally imagined." Camilla felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. "I'm so glad you were able to have that conversation with her." "So am I. But Camilla, there's something else I need to say." She looked at him expectantly. The way you handled these past few days, the support you gave me even when you had reservations, the letter you wrote to Margaret, it showed me again why our marriage works so well. You didn't try to protect me from a difficult experience or compete with an important relationship from my past. You helped me navigate it with integrity. Charles reached for her hand. Margaret was right when she said I was lucky to have you. But more than that, she helped me understand that loving someone means wanting them to be whole, even when that wholeness includes relationships and experiences that don't directly involve you. I learned that too, Camilla said. I realized that my initial resistance to your trip was more about my own insecurity than about any real threat to our relationship. What changed your mind? I realized that Margaret's friendship with you isn't a threat to our marriage because it serves a completely different purpose. She connected you to your past and your ideals. I connect you to your present and your future. Both connections are valuable. Charles smiled, remembering that Margaret had expressed almost exactly the same sentiment. It's remarkable how well you two understood each other, considering how little time you actually spent together. Perhaps women who love the same man develop similar insights about what that man needs, Camilla suggested. The observation made Charles pause. You both loved me, in different ways for different reasons, but yes, Camilla said simply. And I think that's part of why Margaret's goodbye was so important. She needed to know that the love she had given you as a friend would be honored and understood by the love I give you as a wife. Charles felt a profound sense of completion, as if pieces of his emotional life that had been separate were finally fitting together into a coherent whole. I never thought about it that way. Margaret's letter to me wasn't really about friendship, Camilla continued. It was about continuity. She was passing something to me, entrusting me with aspects of your emotional well-being that she had been protecting. The insight was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Charles realized that Margaret's death represented not just the loss of a dear friend, but a transition in how his emotional life was structured. The young man Margaret had known and supported was being entrusted to the care of the woman who knew and loved the person he had become. I think, Charles said slowly, that Margaret orchestrated these past few days more carefully than either of us realized. The urgency of her condition, the things she chose to discuss, even encouraging me to bring you into the conversation through that letter. I think she wanted to ensure that her death brought us closer together, rather than creating distance between us. Camilla considered this possibility. You think she was worried about how her death might affect our marriage? I think she was wise enough to know that major losses can create unexpected tensions in a relationship, and caring enough to try to prevent that from happening. They sat together by the fire for another hour, talking through their memories of the past few days and processing the complex emotions that Margaret's death had brought to the surface. As the evening grew later, Charles found himself feeling something he hadn't expected, a sense of peace about the future. Camilla, he said as they prepared for bed, I want you to know that tomorrow, when I wake up and begin dealing with the practical matters of Margaret's death, the funeral arrangements, the public statements, all of the official business, I'm going to remember what both you and Margaret taught me these past few days. What's that? That the person I am now is not a compromise or a diminishment of the person I used to be. It's an evolution, informed by experience and shaped by love. The idealistic young man Margaret befriended is still here, but he's been tempered by wisdom and supported by partnership. Camilla smiled, hearing in his words the resolution of the concerns that had troubled them both throughout this difficult time. And Margaret's death, Charles continued, doesn't represent the end of my connection to my younger self. It represents the completion of that chapter and the beginning of a new one, where the insights she helped me preserve can be integrated with the life we're building together. As they settled into sleep that night, both Charles and Camilla carried with them a deeper understanding of their relationship and their individual roles in each other's emotional lives. Margaret's final gift to them had been the wisdom to see that love could take many forms, serve many purposes, and coexist without competition when guided by generosity and understanding. The evening meal that night was quieter than usual. Charles and Camilla sat at opposite ends of the small dining table in their private quarters, the formal dining room feeling too grand for their subdued mood. The conversation from the afternoon had left them both thoughtful, processing emotions and concerns they rarely had to confront so directly. Charles picked at his meal, his mind clearly elsewhere. Every few minutes he would glance at his phone, as if expecting another update from Dr. Harrison. The weight of Margaret's condition seemed to press down on him more heavily as the hours passed. "Have you thought about what you'll say to her?" Camilla asked gently, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Charles looked up, seeming almost surprised by the question. "I suppose I haven't really. It seems impossible to prepare for that kind of conversation." 40 years of friendship, Camilla mused. There must be so much you want to tell her. Something in her tone made Charles set down his fork and really look at his wife. Throughout their years together, Camilla had shown remarkable grace in navigating the complexities of his past relationships and connections. She had never demanded that he sever ties with people who had been important to him before their marriage, even when those relationships made things complicated. "Are you having second thoughts about me going?" he asked directly. Camilla considered the question carefully. Since their afternoon conversation, she had been wrestling with her own motivations and concerns. Was she genuinely worried about the practical implications of his trip? Or was there something more personal driving her hesitation? "I want you to go," she said finally. "Margaret deserves to have her goodbye, and you deserve to give it to her. But I also want you to be honest with yourself about what this trip might involve emotionally." Charles leaned back in his chair, studying his wife's face. "What do you think it might involve?" "I think you're going to spend time with someone who knew and loved the person you were before the weight of the crown changed you. I think you're going to remember parts of yourself that you've had to set aside for the sake of duty, and I think saying goodbye to her is going to feel like saying goodbye to those parts of yourself as well." The insight struck Charles as both perceptive and unsettling. Camilla had always been able to see beneath the surface of situations, to understand the emotional undercurrents that others missed. It was one of the qualities that had drawn him to her initially, but sometimes her clarity could be uncomfortable. "And you think that will be harmful somehow?" he asked. "I think it will be painful," she corrected. "And I think when you come back you're going to be grieving more than just Margaret's death. You're going to be grieving the loss of that connection to your younger, more idealistic self." Charles was quiet for a long moment, processing what she was saying. The accuracy of her prediction felt almost unsettling, as if she were describing a future that was already inevitable. "Perhaps that's exactly what I need to do," he said finally. "Perhaps it's time to fully accept what I've become, rather than holding on to connections to who I used to be." The sadness in his voice made Camilla's heart ache. This was the cost of their position that the public rarely saw, the gradual erosion of personal identity under the weight of public responsibility. Charles had carried this burden longer than most, having spent decades as heir apparent before finally assuming the throne. "Or perhaps," Camilla said softly, "the goal isn't to say goodbye to who you were, but to find ways to honor that person within who you've become." Charles looked at her with something approaching surprise. Throughout their conversation, he had sensed her resistance to his trip, her concern about what it might mean for their relationship. But this response suggested a different perspective, one that was more supportive than protective. "You've changed your mind about something," he observed. Camilla nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about what I said earlier, about being worried that you might blame me for not being able to provide what Margaret provided. I realized that was my own insecurity talking, not a rational concern about our relationship." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Margaret's friendship with you isn't a threat to our marriage because it serves a completely different purpose. She connects you to your past and your ideals. I connect you to your present and your future. Both connections are valuable." The insight felt like a revelation to both of them. Charles reached across the table and took Camilla's hand, squeezing it gently. "When did you become so wise about these things?" he asked with a small smile. "Probably around the time I realized that loving someone means wanting them to be whole, even if that wholeness includes parts of their life that don't directly involve you," she replied. They finished their meal in companionable silence, the tension that had marked their earlier conversations finally beginning to ease. But as they prepared for bed, Camilla found herself thinking about the practical details of Charles's trip, and a new concern began to surface. "Charles," she said as they settled into their respective sides of the large bed, "have you considered what Margaret might want to discuss with you? Beyond just saying goodbye?" Charles turned toward her in the dim light. "What do you mean?" People facing death often want to address unfinished business, to say things they've never said, to resolve feelings they've carried for years. Are you prepared for that possibility? The question gave Charles pause. In his focus on Margaret's physical condition and his own need to see her, he hadn't fully considered what she might want from their final meeting. Their friendship had always been characterized by easy communication and mutual understanding. But facing death could bring up emotions and topics they had never explored. I suppose I'll have to be prepared for whatever she needs to discuss, he said. Even if it's difficult? Even if it challenges your understanding of your relationship or your past? Charles considered this. Especially then, if Margaret has things she needs to say, I owe it to her to listen. Camilla nodded, satisfied with his response but still concerned about the emotional toll such conversations might take on him. And if she asks you things you're not prepared to answer? Then I'll be honest about that too, Charles replied. Margaret has always appreciated honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. As they settled into sleep, both Charles and Camilla found their minds still active, processing the day's conversations and preparing for what lay ahead. For Charles, the prospect of seeing Margaret had evolved from a simple visit to say goodbye into something more complex. An opportunity to confront his past, his choices, and the person he had become. For Camilla, her initial resistance to the trip had transformed into something more supportive but also more complex. She genuinely wanted Charles to have the closure he needed. But she also recognized that his return would likely bring its own emotional challenges. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Dr. Harrison's voice was gentle but urgent when Charles answered. Your Majesty, I'm afraid Margaret's condition has deteriorated more rapidly than we anticipated. If you want to see her while she's still able to communicate clearly, I would recommend traveling as soon as possible. Charles felt his stomach drop. How soon? Ideally today. Tomorrow at the latest. Charles looked at Camilla, who had been listening to his side of the conversation. She nodded immediately, understanding what needed to happen. I'll leave this morning, Charles told Dr. Harrison. Please tell Margaret I'm coming. As he ended the call, Charles felt the weight of urgency settle over him. There would be no time for careful preparation, no opportunity to slowly adjust to the idea of this final goodbye. Margaret was dying and he had perhaps hours to reach her. I'll have Lady Sarah make the arrangements immediately, Camilla said, already reaching for her phone. Charles watched his wife spring into action, coordinating travel plans and rearranging schedules with the efficiency that had made her such an effective partner in their royal duties. But beneath her practical focus, he could see the concern in her eyes, the recognition that this sudden urgency made everything more emotionally fraught. Within 2 hours, Charles was ready to leave for Scotland. As he stood in the entrance hall of Windsor Castle, Camilla approached him with something in her hand. I want you to give this to Margaret, she said, holding out a small envelope. Charles looked at the envelope surprised. What is it? A letter, Camilla said simply. Just a few words from one woman to another. I think she might appreciate knowing that I understand how important your friendship has been to you. The gesture moved Charles deeply. In the space of 24 hours, Camilla had moved from resistance to support, from concern about their relationship to active facilitation of his need to say goodbye. It was a demonstration of the generosity and wisdom that had made their marriage work despite all the external pressures they faced. 3 weeks after Margaret's funeral, Charles stood in his study at Windsor Castle looking at a framed photograph that had arrived in the mail that morning. It was a picture of him and Margaret from their university days, both young and laughing at something now lost to memory. Margaret's solicitor had included it with a letter explaining that she had specifically requested it be sent to him after her death. The funeral had been a private affair, attended by Margaret's family and a small circle of close friends. Charles had delivered a eulogy that spoke of her intelligence, her loyalty, and her unwavering commitment to the people she cared about. The media had covered the event respectfully but briefly, noting the king's presence without delving into speculation about their relationship. In the weeks that followed, Charles had found himself processing Margaret's death in unexpected ways. Rather than feeling disconnected from his younger self, as both he and Camilla had feared, he felt more integrated. The conversations with Margaret had helped him see the continuity in his life, rather than the disconnections. Camilla entered the study carrying 2 cups of tea a routine they had established in the aftermath of Margaret's death. These quiet moments together had become precious to both of them, opportunities to check in with each other and process the ongoing changes in their emotional landscape. "The photograph is lovely," Camilla said, setting Charles's tea on his desk and glancing at the framed picture. "You both look so carefree." "We were," Charles replied with a smile, though I'm not sure either of us really understood what lay ahead of us then. "Do any of us ever really understand what lies ahead?" Camilla asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. Charles considered the question. "Probably not. But I think that's part of what Margaret was trying to tell me during our last conversation. The fact that life doesn't unfold exactly as we planned doesn't mean we've failed or compromised our essential selves." "Have you thought about what you want to do with her letter?" Camilla asked. Margaret had left Charles a sealed envelope to be opened 1 month after her death. It sat unopened in his desk drawer, a final communication from his oldest friend that he hadn't yet felt ready to receive. "I think I'm ready to read it now," Charles said, opening the drawer and removing the envelope. Camilla started to stand. "I can give you privacy if you'd prefer." "No," Charles said quickly. "Stay. Whatever Margaret wrote, I'd like to share it with you." He opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Margaret's handwriting was weaker than usual but still recognizable, and her words were characteristically thoughtful and direct. Charles read silently for a moment, then looked up at Camilla with an expression of surprise and emotion. "She wrote about us," he said, "about our marriage and what she observed during her final months." "What did she say?" Charles began to read aloud. "My dear Charles, if you are reading this, then I have died and you have survived the experience of losing me. I hope it was not as devastating as you feared it might be." He paused, smiling slightly at Margaret's characteristic blend of affection and dry humor. "I have spent my final months thinking about your life and the choices you have made, particularly your marriage to Camilla. I want you to know that watching the two of you together over the years has given me great peace about your future." Charles looked up at Camilla, who was listening intently. "When you first told me you were going to marry Camilla, I will admit I had concerns. Not about her personally, but about whether anyone could truly understand and support the complex person you had become after everything you had experienced. I worried that you might feel the need to simplify yourself to make the relationship work." "She was worried about that?" Camilla asked. "Apparently," Charles continued reading, "but observing your marriage changed my perspective completely. Camilla doesn't ask you to be simpler than you are. She helps you be more fully yourself. She supports your environmental work, your interfaith initiatives, your commitment to traditional crafts and sustainable communities. She doesn't see these interests as burdens or distractions from your royal duties. She sees them as essential parts of who you are." Charles paused, feeling the truth of Margaret's observation. "More importantly, she has given you something I never could, a partnership for the future. I have been a keeper of your memories and ideals, but Camilla is a builder of your ongoing life. She helps you translate those ideals into practical action within the constraints of your position." Camilla felt tears beginning to form. Margaret's understanding of their relationship was more generous and perceptive than she had ever imagined. Charles continued, "I want you to know, Charles, that I am not worried about you anymore. For many years I carried concern about whether you would be able to remain true to yourself while fulfilling your royal obligations. Watching your marriage to Camilla has convinced me that you have found a way to do both." "The letter goes on," Charles said, looking up at Camilla, "but she has a message specifically for you." "For me?" Charles read, "Please tell Camilla that I am grateful to her for loving the whole of you, not just the public figure or even just the private man, but the complex individual who contains both idealism and pragmatism, both duty and personal desires. Thank her for creating a space in your life where all parts of yourself can coexist." Camilla was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the generosity of Margaret's final words. "There's more," Charles said. She writes, "I hope that my death will not create sadness or anxiety in your marriage. Instead, I hope it will help you both understand how precious and rare it is to find someone who truly sees and supports who you are. The love I gave you as a friend was important, but it was preparation for the love you share as husband and wife." Charles set down the letter and looked at his wife. "Margaret understood our relationship better than we understood it ourselves. She certainly understood what I was worried about, Camilla said, and she took the time to address those concerns directly. What strikes me most, Charles said, is how she framed my evolution over the years. She didn't see the changes as losses or compromises. She saw them as growth that allowed me to become more effective at pursuing the same goals I had always cared about. Camilla nodded, and she recognized that our marriage supports that effectiveness rather than limiting it. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where he had wandered so restlessly just weeks earlier. I've been thinking about something Margaret said during our last conversation. She told me that the fact that I still struggle with the gap between vision and reality proves that I haven't lost my essential self. That's a profound insight, Camilla said. It is, and it's helped me understand something about our marriage that I hadn't fully appreciated before. Charles turned back to face Camilla. You don't just support my work and my interests. You help me navigate the ethical complexities of my position without losing sight of my core values. When I'm struggling with difficult decisions, you help me find solutions that honor both my obligations and my principles. That's what partnership should be, Camilla said. But it's more than that. Margaret helped me see that the person I was at 20 had ideals, but little understanding of how to implement them in the real world. The person I am now has both the ideals and the experience to pursue them effectively, and our marriage is part of what makes that effectiveness possible. Charles returned to his chair and took Camilla's hand. Margaret's death could have made me nostalgic for a simpler time when my vision of the future was clearer. Instead, it's made me more grateful for the complex, nuanced life we've built together. I'm so glad, Camilla said. I was genuinely worried that losing her would make you feel more isolated or constrained. The opposite happened. Her final conversations with me and this letter helped me see that the constraints I sometimes feel aren't compromises of my essential self. They're the framework within which I can actually accomplish the things I care about. Charles squeezed Camilla's hand gently. And you're not just someone who accepts those constraints with me. You're someone who helps me work creatively within them to achieve meaningful results. They sat together in comfortable silence, both processing the gift of understanding that Margaret had given them through her final communications. The late afternoon light filled the study with warmth, and Charles found himself feeling more at peace than he had in months. I want to do something, he said suddenly. What's that? I want to establish a foundation in Margaret's memory, focused on supporting young people who want to pursue careers in environmental conservation and sustainable development. Camilla smiled. That's perfect. It honors both her memory and the ideals you shared. More than that, Charles said. It's an example of what Margaret helped me understand. I can take the environmental passion I had as a young man and channel it into practical action that fits my current position and resources. When do you want to announce it? Soon. I think Margaret would appreciate knowing that her death led to something constructive rather than just to grief and nostalgia. As evening approached, Charles and Camilla prepared for dinner with a sense of resolution that had been building since Margaret's death.